My name is Emily Hart. I'm 36 years old, and I spent 12 years building a real estate appraisal practice out of a folding table in my garage while my own mother introduced me at parties as my daughter, the one who measures other people's houses. That was the joke. Measures other people's houses. Like I was a tape measure with a pulse, useful for exactly one thing, and forgettable the rest of the time. What none of them knew, what I had made absolutely sure none of them knew, was that I hadn't just been appraising houses for the last 3 years. I had been quietly acquiring them. But none of that mattered on the night of my 36th birthday, when my mother, Vivian Hart, stood at the head of the dining table in our family's Battery Front home in Charleston, South Carolina, and slid a thick legal folder across the white tablecloth toward me, like she was dealing a hand of cards she already knew she'd win. "Sign it, Emily," she said. Tonight. The chandelier above us threw soft gold light on 12 faces, and every single one of them went still. I could hear the ice shift in my uncle's glass. Somewhere in the kitchen, a server set a tray down, a little too hard, and the clink sounded like a gunshot in that silence. Even the candles on my cake seemed to hold their breath. 36 little flames flickering against the draft from the hallway. I looked down at the folder. It was already tabbed, little yellow flags marking every page where my signature was supposed to go. I hadn't been given a copy in advance. I hadn't been told what it was. I was simply expected to open it, sign it, and smile, the way I'd been trained to do since I was 7 years old, and learned that questioning my mother cost more than it was ever worth. "What is it?" I asked. Her face didn't move. Her voice did, dropping into that register she used only when she wanted a room to feel her patience running out. "It protects the family." That sentence told me everything. In 20 years of watching Vivian Hart operate, I had learned that whenever she said something protected the family, it meant it protected her. And the family was simply the shield she was holding it up with. She had used that phrase before, when she quietly removed my name from my late father's foundation board, when she restructured the family trust. The year I turned 30 and somehow came out with sole signing authority, when she explained why my consulting income should be pooled with household expenses instead of staying in my own account. I reached for the first page. Her hand came down over mine. Not hard enough to bruise, just hard enough to remind everyone at that table exactly who was still in charge. "You have always been difficult," she said, loud enough for my cousins to hear, loud enough for my brother Grant to stare very intently at his plate. "Always convinced you're smarter than the rest of us. Always so suspicious." I looked around that table one more time, giving every person there one last chance to be someone other than who I already knew they were. My aunt studied her wine glass like it owed her money. My cousin suddenly found her phone fascinating. Grant, the golden son, the one who'd never had to build anything, because everything had simply been handed to him on a silver serving tray, said nothing at all. He just kept cutting his steak into smaller and smaller pieces, like if he shrank it enough, he wouldn't have to look up. Then my mother stood, pointed one manicured finger at the front door, and said the 2 words that would end up costing her everything. "Get out." Nobody stopped her. Nobody followed me. I picked up my coat, left my birthday cake sitting untouched under its little forest of candles, and walked out into the humid Charleston night, knowing exactly one thing with total clarity. She had chosen tonight, my birthday, in front of everyone, because she assumed I had nowhere else to go. She had no idea how wrong she was. If you've ever sat at a family table and realized you weren't a daughter, you were a line item, drop a comment below. I want to know I'm not the only one who's felt that. I sat in my car outside the house for exactly 6 minutes. I know because I watched the dashboard clock tick from 9:41 to 9:47. While the windows behind me glowed warm and undisturbed, like nothing had happened at all. Someone was probably already sliding my cake into the trash, scraping 36 candles worth of wax into a napkin, like it was nothing, like I was nothing. The old Emily would have driven straight to a hotel and replayed every insult until sunrise, building a case in her head for why her own mother could look at her like that and feel nothing. The old Emily would have called Grant, crying, asking what she'd done wrong, apologizing for a fight she didn't start. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I hadn't been for 3 years. Not since the morning I sat in a conference room in downtown Charleston and watched a bank appraiser undervalue a waterfront estate by nearly 40%. Because the owner was an elderly widow who didn't know how to fight for herself. I'd corrected that appraisal, saved her $400,000 in a bad sale, and she'd hugged me at the closing table and told me I had an old soul for numbers. I never forgot that feeling. Being useful to someone who actually saw you, instead of someone who only saw what you could hand over. My family had never once looked at me that way. For 3 years, I had taken every appraisal fee, every consulting contract, every dollar I earned outside of what my mother controlled through the family trust, and I had funneled it, quietly, patiently, into a private acquisitions fund under a holding company with my middle name on the paperwork instead of my last one. Hart wasn't on a single document, only Rosalind. The name my father used to call me when I was small enough to sit on his shoulders at the marina. My family thought I did little appraisal jobs. They had no idea my fund had closed on 11 properties in 3 years, or that the 12th was scheduled to close the very next morning. At 9:52 p.m., while I was still parked outside the house that had just thrown me away, my phone buzzed. An email from the closing attorney. Handling Wren Manor, a private barrier island estate off the Georgia coast, built in the 1892 by a shipping family. Sold to me through blind trust after 8 months of quiet negotiation. $87 million. Paid in full, no mortgage, no trust, my mother could touch, no name on the deed, but mine, funds verified. Closing confirmed for 8:30 a.m. I read it 3 times. Then I laughed once. Not because anything was funny, but because the timing felt almost cruel in its perfection. My mother had just stood in front of my entire family and thrown me into the street like something she'd found spoiled in the refrigerator. In less than 11 hours, I would own an island she didn't even know existed. If you think that's the end of it, wait until you see what she didn't know I'd already found. Chapter 2 gets worse for her. In the best way, I didn't drive to a hotel that night. I drove to my small appraisal office near the harbor, past the shrimp boats docked for the evening and the smell of salt and diesel that had always meant safety to me, in a way my mother's house never had. I unlocked a filing cabinet I hadn't opened in over a year and pulled out a manila envelope. My father's old business partner had mailed me 18 months before he passed. On the front, in handwriting I hadn't seen in years, it said, "Open this only if your mother ever asks you to sign something." My hands were shaking when I broke the seal. Inside was a flash drive. A photograph of my father holding me at maybe 4 years old on the porch of a house I didn't recognize, and one line written on the back of an old birthday card, the ink faded but still legible. "Emily, if she ever tries to take your name, your work, or what's yours, don't argue with her. Just start reading the paperwork." I sat there for a long time under the buzzing fluorescent light of my own office. That birthday card in my hands, my untouched cake still sitting on a table 30 minutes away, and I understood something for the first time in 36 years. My mother hadn't thrown me out because I was difficult. She'd thrown me out because I was the only person left who might actually read the paperwork. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk, with the flash drive plugged into my laptop, watching the little loading wheel spin, while rain started tapping against the office window, soft at first, then harder, like the sky itself had run out of patience with me for taking so long to open a folder that had been waiting 18 months to be opened. The drive had exactly one file, a scanned PDF 42 pages, titled simply, Hart Family Holdings, Internal Memo 2011. I recognized my father's handwriting in the margins before I'd even finished the first paragraph. Small, cramped, slanted hard to the right. The same handwriting that used to sign my school permission slips and leave notes on the kitchen counter. That said things like gone to check on the Pemberton. Lot back by 6. Love you, Rosalind. The memo was a valuation report. My father had commissioned it himself, quietly, 2 years before he died of a heart attack at his own desk, on a Tuesday morning that started like every other Tuesday and ended with a funeral 3 days later. It documented every property in the Hart family portfolio. 23 parcels along the coast, most of them appraised decades earlier and never reassessed since. My father's note in the margin, dated the same year, said V. Knows these numbers are wrong. She has kept them wrong on purpose. I read that sentence 4 times before it landed. My mother had spent 15 years telling me that the Hart portfolio was modest. Comfortable, but modest. A few rental properties, a beach house, nothing extravagant. She used that story every single time I asked for help, covering a business loan in my 20s. We do not have that kind of money, Emily. You know how tight things are for this family. According to my father's own valuation, tight was 23 properties worth, in 2011 dollars alone, just under $60 million. I sat back in my chair and let that number settle into my chest like a stone, dropping slowly through still water. The kind you feel more than hear, if you have ever been told your family was struggling while somebody quietly sat on millions. Comment the word arithmetic below. You will understand exactly what I mean by the end of this chapter. The rain kept coming as I kept reading. Page after page, my father had cross-referenced tax filings, insurance records, and county assessments, building a case that read less like an accountant's memo and more like an appraiser training his daughter, without her ever knowing it was happening. Now I understood. He had known even then that one day I would need to read something exactly like this, and he wanted my hands steady when the day came. The last page of the memo was not part of the valuation at all. It was a separate letter, dated 3 weeks before his death, addressed to an attorney named Thomas Reyes in Savannah, a name I had never once heard spoken in our house. Thomas, if anything happens to me, I want Emily's portion protected outside of Vivian's control. She will not like it. Do it anyway. She has already tried twice to have the Wexford parcel, retitled solely in her name, and I believe she will try again with everything else, once I am no longer here to stop her. Twice, my mother had tried twice while my father was still alive, to move property out of joint ownership and into her name alone. I thought about every family dinner where she had called me ungrateful for asking questions. Every time she'd said I was, always so suspicious. Like suspicion was some character flaw, instead of a survival skill I had apparently inherited from a father, who saw all of this coming a full decade before I did. I searched the name Thomas Reyes, Savannah attorney. His firm still existed. Same address, a newer website, a photo of a man in his 60s with silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. The kind of face that had probably kept a lot of quiet secrets over the years. I did not call that night. It was almost 2 a.m, and there are some conversations you do not start until you are steady enough to actually hear the answer. Instead, I did what I had trained myself to do for 3 years, whenever the ground under me shifted without warning. I built a table. Not a real one, a spreadsheet, my oldest habit, the same one I used on every appraisal job I had ever taken. 1 column for what I knew. 1 column for what I could prove. 1 column, by far the smallest, for what I could still only guess at, known. My mother controlled a family trust worth far more than she had ever admitted, known. My father had tried to protect my share of it years before he died. Provable so far, almost nothing. Everything in that memo was 13 years old now. I needed current numbers. What that portfolio looked like today, after 13 more years of my mother, managing it entirely alone, with nobody checking her math. I needed to do exactly what I did for a living, appraise something. Someone was hoping nobody would ever look at closely again. This is the part where most people would drive home and confront their mother directly. Remember what happened the last time I asked her a direct question at that dinner table. So instead, I did what she taught me, entirely by accident, to do better than anyone left in that family. I went quiet, and I went to work. By sunrise, I had a plan that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with arithmetic. I would close on Wren Manor at 8:30 exactly as scheduled, because that deal was mine, clean, already untouchable. Then, once the island was legally mine, I would drive to Savannah and ask Thomas Reyes exactly what my father had spent his final months trying to protect, and why he'd never told me any of it himself. I showered in the small bathroom behind my office, put on the same navy dress I'd worn to my own birthday dinner, because I hadn't gone home to pack a bag, and looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. My eyes were tired but steady. My hands, for the first time in almost 12 hours, weren't shaking. I thought about my mother's voice saying, "Get out," and for the first time, instead of feeling it as punishment, I heard it as a mistake. She had removed the one person in the family who knew how to read a balance sheet from the one house, where the balance sheet had never once actually added up. At 7:15, I drove across the Ravenel Bridge toward the coast, salt air pouring through my cracked window, gulls wheeling low over the gray water, like they already knew something in my life was about to change permanently. Behind me, Charleston was waking up to a version of the story where a difficult, ungrateful daughter had stormed out over nothing. Fee. Ahead of me was a closing table, an island about to carry my name on its deed, and an attorney who had apparently spent 13 patient yet years waiting for someone to walk through his door and ask the right question. Somewhere past the halfway point of the bridge, I pulled my phone from the cup holder and opened a folder of old family photos I hadn't looked at in years. There was one from when I was maybe 6, standing on our dock in a life jacket, 2 sizes too big, my father's hand resting on top of my head like a crown he'd placed there on purpose. My mother was in the background of that photo too, half turned away, looking at something off camera that clearly mattered more to her than either of us did. I had never noticed that detail before. I noticed it now. If you think Chapter 1 was the real setup, wait. My mother believed she had closed a door on me for good. She had no idea. She had just handed me the one piece of evidence she had spent 15 years trying to keep buried. Comment Island if you're ready for Chapter 3, where I find out exactly how deep this goes. Thomas Reyes's office sat above a coffee shop on a quiet side street in Savannah, the kind of building where the floorboards announced every visitor before the receptionist could. I arrived at 9:40, 20 minutes after signing my name on the final page, at the Wren Manor closing, my hands still faintly cramped from the sheer number of initials an $87 million transaction required. I did not go home first. I did not shower again, or change out of the navy dress. I wanted to walk into that office looking exactly like a woman who had just been thrown out of her own family and had not slept because of it. Because that was the truth. And I had learned that truth was the sharpest tool I owned. He recognized my last name before I finished saying it. I watched something shift behind his glasses, a kind of relief mixed with dread, like a man who had been carrying a locked box for 13 years and had just been handed the key he never expected to see again. "You look like him," he said, around the eyes. Nobody had ever told me that before. My mother spent 2 decades insisting. I favored her side of the family entirely, that I had inherited nothing from my father but his stubbornness. Sitting in that office, hearing a stranger say, "I look like him," I felt something crack loose in my chest that I had not realized was still sealed shut. Thomas pulled a thick folder from a locked cabinet behind his desk, the kind built for documents never meant to sit in a normal filing system. "Your father came to me in 2011, he said. "He was not sick yet. He was not dying. He was simply careful, and he had good reason to be." The folder contained everything the flash drive had only hinted at. Full valuations, updated twice more before my father's death, showing the Hart portfolio climbing steadily as coastal property values rose across the decade. But it was the second document that made my stomach turn cold. A trust structure, drafted and fully executed the year I turned 29, naming me as a beneficiary of a separate holding entity my father had built entirely outside the family, trust my mother controlled. He funded it slowly, Thomas explained. Small transfers over 4 years, structured so they wouldn't trigger reporting requirements that might have alerted your mother. By the time he passed, it held 4 properties independent of everything she managed. 2 commercial buildings downtown, a warehouse near the port, and a parcel of undeveloped coastal land in Beaufort County that has more than tripled in value since he acquired it. If you have ever discovered your family was hiding something from you, for your own protection, comment the word "protected" below. I want to know how many of you understand what that word actually costs a person. I asked the obvious question, the one that had been building in my chest since I opened that flash drive at 2 in the morning. Why did nobody tell me any of this existed? Thomas was quiet a moment. Because your father structured the release around a trigger clause. The trust would remain dormant, invisible to you, until one of 2 conditions was met. Either you reached the age of 40, or your mother attempted to exert legal or financial control over you without your consent. He wanted you to build your own life first, without knowing there was a safety net underneath you, He was worried that knowing would make you less like yourself. I thought about the folder my mother had slid across the birthday table 2 nights earlier, the tabbed pages, the demand to sign without reading. Sign it, Emily. Tonight. That was the trigger, I said. Thomas nodded slowly. If what you're describing is accurate, if that document attempted to grant her any authority over your existing assets, then yes. The clause activated the moment she demanded your signature in front of witnesses, which means, legally, everything in this folder became yours 3 nights ago. You simply didn't know it yet. I sat very still, feeling the floor of my entire life quietly rearrange itself beneath me. I had walked in, believing I was hunting for evidence of what my mother had taken. I was walking out having learned that my father had spent his final years quietly building a fortress around me that I had never once seen, because I was never supposed to see it until the exact moment I needed it most. This is the part where the arithmetic finally became unavoidable. Not metaphorical arithmetic. Actual numbers, actual dates, actual signatures, laid out across a lawyer's desk in black and white. My mother had controlled a portfolio worth tens of millions, while telling me for 15 years that our family was comfortable but modest. My father had quietly built a second, smaller fortune specifically, so his daughter would never be as powerless as her mother clearly intended her to be. And somewhere between those two facts sat the real answer to a question I had been avoiding my entire adult life. Had my mother ever actually loved me, or had she simply calculated, the way I calculate square footage and comparable sales, exactly how useful I could be kept before I became a liability? Infrastructure is not family, I said out loud, mostly to myself. Thomas looked up from the documents. What was that? He asked. I didn't answer him directly. I was thinking about every birthday dinner, every holiday, every moment my mother had introduced me to guests as her daughter, the one who measures other people's houses. And I finally understood what those introductions had actually been. Not affection dressed up as humor positioning. She had spent years quietly training everyone around her, including me, to see me as small, so nobody would ever ask why the daughter who worked the hardest owned the least. If you've ever realized you were being kept small on purpose, not by accident, but as a strategy, drop the word infrastructure in the comments. I promise you're not imagining it. Thomas slid one final page toward me, a letter, sealed, my name written across the front in my father's handwriting, left with instructions that it only be given to me once the trust activated. Once I'd already seen the numbers and understood what had been protected, and why. I didn't open it in his office. I folded it carefully and placed it inside my bag, beside the closing documents for Wren Manor, because I understood, sitting there, that I was no longer the same woman who had walked out of her mother's house 2 nights earlier with nothing but a coat and a birthday cake. She never got to eat. I now had an island. I had 4 properties I never knew existed. I had a lawyer who had spent 13 years waiting to finally do his job, and I had a letter from a dead man who had somehow, impossibly, still found a way to protect me from beyond his own funeral. My mother believed she had removed a problem from her table. What she had actually done was activate the one safeguard she never knew existed, built by a man she had spent years underestimating, just as thoroughly as she had underestimated me. Before I left, Thomas asked me one question that stayed with me the entire drive back toward the coast. What are you going to do with all of it? I told him the truth. I didn't fully know yet. But I knew it wouldn't look like revenge for the sake of revenge. It would look like arithmetic, finished properly, in daylight, with every number checked twice. The way my father had taught me without either ever realized, and that was the lesson. On the drive back, I stopped once at a gas station outside Beaufort, the same county, where my father's undeveloped coastal parcel apparently sat waiting for me to even learn its name. I didn't go look at it that day. I simply sat in my car with the engine off, windows cracked, listening to the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday afternoon, and let myself feel something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in almost 2 days. Not triumph, not even anger anymore, just a quiet, exhausted relief. I thought about calling Grant. I did not. I thought about calling my mother too, if only to hear what excuse she would reach for. I did not do that either. Some calls are more useful unmade, held in reserve like evidence. If you think this story is close to over, it is not. My mother has not yet learned what I know. Comment the word ready if you want to see what happens. The moment she finds out her daughter has read every single page. I did not go back to Charleston for 11 days. I stayed at Wren Manor, walking the property line by line the way I appraised any new acquisition. Except this time, every room felt like it belonged to someone who had earned it, instead of someone hiding from a family that never wanted her in the first place. Elias Grant, the estate manager who came with the sale, handed me the keys on my second morning there and said only, "Welcome home, Miss Hart." Nobody in my family had ever said those 2 words to me without attaching a condition to them first. The first 2 nights, I barely slept. Not from anxiety this time, but because the house itself seemed to hum with a kind of attention I had never experienced anywhere before. Every hallway had a story. Elias was slowly willing to tell me, piece by piece, over coffee on the back porch each morning. I found myself making lists without meaning to, the same way I built spreadsheets for my clients, except this time the columns were for myself. What needs fixing? What can wait? What I actually want this place to become, beyond simply being proof that I had won something. On the 3rd night, I finally opened my father's letter. Emily, if you are reading this, then Thomas has done exactly what I asked him to do. I built this trust in silence, because I was afraid that if you knew about it too early, you would stop building your own life and simply wait for mine. I wanted you working, learning, becoming someone capable of protecting what was already yours, before you ever needed to use it. If your mother has tried to take control of you the way I always feared she would, do not scream at her. Just show her the paperwork, calmly, the way I taught you to read every document twice before you trust it. She has spent her whole life underestimating people who stay quiet. Do not let her underestimate you for one more day. I read that letter 4 times before I finally put it down. If you have ever received something from someone, after they were already gone, that finally explained everything. You spent years not understanding. Comment the word finally below. I think more of you have a letter like this waiting somewhere than you realize. On the 12th day, I drove back to Charleston, not to my mother's house, but to a private conference room at a law firm downtown, the same kind of room where I had once corrected a bank appraiser's mistake for a widow who never expected anyone to fight for her. I had Thomas Reyes on one side of me, and my forensic accountant, Priya Kapoor, on the other. I invited my mother, my brother Grant, and 2 members of the Family Trust's Oversight Board to what I described only as a meeting regarding recent estate matters. My mother arrived in pearls and a cream-colored coat, expecting, I think, an apology. She did not get one. I laid out the documents slowly. The 2011 valuation, the trust structure naming me as beneficiary. The trigger clause activated the night. She demanded my signature in front of 12 witnesses. My mother's face did not move for the first several minutes, but her fingers tightened slowly around her handbag strap until her knuckles went pale. She tried one angle, quietly, before the room turned against her completely. "Emily," she said, her voice softer than I had heard. "In years, you have to understand I was only ever trying to protect this family from outside interference. Your father made some decisions near the end that were not always clear-headed." I let her finish the sentence in full, because I wanted everyone in that room to hear the exact shape of the lie before I answered it. Then I slid one more document across the table. A physician's letter from 2011 confirming my father's complete mental competency at the time the trust was established. A letter Thomas had quietly obtained the week before, because he suspected she'd try exactly this angle the moment she felt cornered. My mother did not finish her next sentence. She simply set her hands back in her lap and stopped talking entirely. "You went behind my back," she finally said. "No," I said. "You went behind mine for 15 years. I just finally caught up." For a moment nobody spoke. One board member quietly slid the valuation closer to himself, reading it a second time. Priya, beside me, had the stillness of someone who already knows how a case ends and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. Grant did not say a word the entire meeting. He sat with his eyes fixed on the table, the same way he had at my birthday dinner, while our mother pointed toward the door. I'd stopped expecting him to defend me years ago. What surprised me was watching him finally understand, in real time, that his silence at that dinner table had never been neutral. It had been a choice. This is the part of the story where most people expect fireworks, a screaming match, a dramatic exit. That's not what happened, and honestly, that's the lesson worth sitting with longer than any of it. Real power does not need volume. My mother had spent her whole life mistaking control for love and volume for authority. And in that quiet room, surrounded by documents she could not argue with, she finally understood that neither had ever actually worked. Not on me. Not anymore. The oversight board voted 3 weeks later to formally separate my father's independent trust from any further influence by my mother. She kept her portion of the original family trust. Nobody took that from her. What she lost was control over the parts that were never hers to begin with, and the version of the story where she got to decide who in this family counted and who didn't. She called me once, about a month later, and I almost didn't answer. When I did, she didn't apologize. Not really. She said something closer to an explanation, that she'd only ever wanted to keep the family together, that structure mattered, that someone had to be in charge. I let her finish, then told her that keeping a family together is not the same as keeping control of it. She had no response. For once, the silence on her end wasn't a weapon. It was just silence, and I let it sit there until we quietly hung up. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this: you do not have to burn a bridge to stop being controlled by the people standing on it. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply read the paperwork, check the arithmetic, and let the truth do the rest of the work for you. I still see my mother occasionally. At family functions I choose to attend on my own terms now. We are not close, and I've made peace with that. But I am no longer the daughter who sat quietly while someone slid a folder across a table and told her to sign her life away without reading it. I read everything now. My father taught me that lesson without ever explaining why it mattered. Until the exact night I needed it most. Wren Manor still sits off the Georgia coast, and some mornings I stand on the dock, where Elias first handed me those keys, and think about how close I came to signing that folder, just to keep the peace. Love does not ask you to sign blindly. Love does not require your silence as proof of loyalty. Some evenings, Elias and I walk the property line together while he points out repairs the previous owners let slide for years. And I find myself thinking, this is what I actually wanted the entire time. Not a castle, not a number in an account, just somewhere I could stand without owing my presence to someone else's approval. My father understood that about me before I understood it myself. He never tried to buy my loyalty with money. He simply made sure that when the day came, I'd have the tools to stand on my own. If this story meant something to you, if you saw even a piece of your own family in Emily's table that night, subscribe to Shadow Drama Stories so you never miss the next one. There are so many more women out there just like her, quietly doing the arithmetic, while everyone around them assumes they're simply being difficult. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have done in that dining room. I read every single one.